When the Jews were looking for their Messiah, they were looking for a king. And as we look back in faith to Jesus' ministry, we claim Christ as the king. We expect him to be a king. He preached about the kingdom, and in the end, he made very clear to us that he has been given all authority on heaven and on earth. And yet, when he's talking to Pilate, he says that his kingdom is not of this world. And so, as his disciples, we're left with a puzzle here. How do we understand our relationship to worldly power? How do we understand the relationship between the church, which Christ created, and the state, which Christ rules? In this lecture, we will review the history of the relationship between church and state in order to better discern how we should respond to the state today. Now, in the first years after Jesus ascended into heaven, the Roman authorities didn't really take Christianity all that seriously. To them, it was just another one of the Jewish sects, the different interpretations of Judaism. And it took a while for it to establish its own identity as separate from Judaism. And Judaism was tolerated even though they would not go along with the Roman polytheistic religion. But Christians were persecuted off and on throughout this period. They had very little worldly power, and their focus, rather than getting earthly power, was on the coming king and his kingdom. Now all this changed in 313 when Constantine passed into law the Edict of Milan, which made it legal to be a Christian. It was no longer against the Roman religion and gave it most favored religion status. So it was tolerated for the first time in its history. And just a few decades later, in 380, the Edict of Thessalonica made it the official religion. And so at that point, it had all the power that was to be had in the Roman world at that time. And so this brings us into the era of Christendom, which we usually associate with the medieval period, but it began before the medieval age historically. And the church began to amass wealth and land and power because the Roman authorities wanted to undo the injustices of the past. And so they restored land and gave them power and wealth. And so this began a period where the state not only tolerated the church, but the state was for the church. And while the Roman authorities definitely wanted to benefit from associating with Christendom, there were generally good intentions behind the activity. Nevertheless, wealth and land and power invited corruption. Because once the Christians have power rather than persecution, people are attracted to Christianity not because they believe it, but because they want to share in that power. Now, over time, the power centers change and Roman power concentrates in the east and in the area of Constantinople and present-day Turkey. And so this is where the Greek, or now the Byzantine Empire, takes shape. But in the West, the church continued to hold power, and especially holding on to this idea of the Roman bishop as the successor to Peter, and therefore the greatest in all of Christendom. The Eastern Church did not agree with this interpretation, but it made for a lot of political power in the West, and increasingly so throughout the ages. Now, during this time, the Western Empire was weak at best, and Europe was mainly ruled by barbarian forces, and it kept the Western Roman Empire weak politically. Now, all of this changed in 800 with the crowning of Charlemagne. It was Charles the Great, the king of the Franks, came to the Pope to be crowned by the Pope so that there would be an alliance between the Franks and the Christian church, and this benefited both sides. Charles gained the prestige of the Roman Empire, and the Pope gained the prestige of being the kingmaker. And so this began a new phase in church history where now the church is over the state. And their theology reflected this activity because God's kingdom is over man's, they said. The church should rule the state. So this characterizes the way that church and state related to one another throughout the medieval period in Western Europe. Now again, we're following the story in the West, and with advances in technology and hygiene and trade and commerce, eventually the West begins to grow in learning, and develops an appetite for more power. And so we begin to see more challenges to papal authority. And finally, these challenges break through, especially with Luther and the German princes. So what was, for the Reformation, the beginning of the Protestant denomination and a separate church organization, was also the opportunity for the German princes to be free of Roman Catholic rule. The breakup of the church and the breakup of the state coincide. Now, this arrangement was finalized in the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. Christendom became divided for the first time officially. And of course, this becomes a pattern for other states who want to break with Rome and establish their own religion. So Lutheranism is the hallmark of the German provinces. We have Anglicanism in England. We have one version of Reformed theology in Switzerland. We have another develop in the Dutch territories. And it comes to be that in each separate state, the ruler decided which version of the Christian faith would be the law of the land in their country. And one fascinating fact of history is that when the format of the government changed in any of these states, it typically coincided with changes in church government. So if you think about Roman Catholicism and its Episcopalian style of government, where it's very top-down hierarchy, that's a great fit for monarchy. But we see in other provinces that republicanism and Presbyterianism grow together, the idea of representative government. And furthermore, congregationalism and democracy tend to grow up together, where the people decide the government, the congregation comes to rule the church. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to be this way, but that's just the direction that the church has taken due to human nature. And finally, in 1648, the Peace of Westphalia makes very clear that the state is over the church. There is no longer any willingness for the modern state to follow the church's lead. And so at this point, we can see in the story, we've begun from a place where the church had no power to gaining status, to aligning church and state, and then for church to become overstate. And now these things are slowly rolling their ways backward. But we still have a close relationship between church and state. And it's not until we get to America that we really start to see any kind of diversity on that front. Now, initially, there was no toleration even in America. You went to different colonies that could have their own religion, but there was no separation of church and state there. The only exception to that was in Rhode Island, where the Baptists decided that they would tolerate non-Baptists. And so they are seen as the forerunners to the way that America unfolds. But it's a double-edged sword, because while there is freedom of religion for everyone, that opens up the opportunity to get further and further away from Christianity. Eventually, it comes to be a doctrine of America that there is separation of church and state, although it did not happen overnight. And even after America became a nation and incorporated the colonies as states, different states had official churches for decades afterward. But with the separation of church and state comes tolerance, and with tolerance we see that our differences become downplayed. Because essentially what tolerance says is whatever is different between us does not matter. Now, it does not necessarily have to be that way, but that's just the natural way that things tend to go. And so if you look, for example, at the history of higher education in America, it begins with denomination-led schools, and as schools opened up to people from other denominations, they began relaxing their doctrinal commitments. And at first, this just allowed other denominations. But then you start to get into unorthodox forms of Christianity, so things like deism or Unitarianism that denies the Trinity. It's a very rationalized form of Christianity. But as the century rolls on, eventually you start to allow non-Christians, non-Protestants first of all, then Jews, and then non-theists altogether, to where now we are at the point where even any religion is allowed or no religion at all. Now, we might be used to this today, but it was not always so. Tolerance has naturally led to openness beyond Christianity, beyond religion, so that not only is there a toleration of religion, but it's actually turned a corner to where one could argue that pluralism has become the only tolerated view. Pluralism is the de facto religion in America. Now, one interesting development in the 20th century is evangelicalism has attempted in the middle of the 20th century to reassert its influence over the nation. And one example of this is something called the Seven Hills Mandate, where people who decided to try and make America a Christian nation again identified 7 centers of cultural power and began to make plans to try and assert their influence there and to even take those over in order to turn America back toward God. Whether that's a good idea or not, or whether it has been successful or not, is a subject of debate. But it's a great example of how Christians are uneasy with the thought of not having any cultural power, because for so much of its history, it has had not just most favored religion status, but an official power, sometimes even power over the state. And in our desire to follow Christ, we desire to have that power in order to follow him better. Denominations differ on how to think about worldly power, and it causes divisions in the church, especially today. Is separation necessary? Or is the church necessarily political? These questions are hotly debated, but wherever we land, we must remember to live out the essential unity of the church, even when we disagree, and not to see one another as obstacles in our pursuit of cultural engagement in the political realm.